Hello everyone, and welcome back for some more Hour of Devastation Limited Review. I'm Nitsahone, and so far this week I've covered all the cards in white, blue, black, and red, and today I'm doing green. Tomorrow I will cover the remainder of the cards in this set, which are gold, cards, artifacts, and lands. Before we start with today's set review, here is a quick reminder on how I grade these cards. If you've already seen this, you can skip it by clicking on a timestamp in the description below. Just like with Amonkhet, I'm using letter grades to help me to explain how good I think these cards will be in the new format, and I will provide a letter grade for every card after discussing each of them. These grades are an easy way of summing up what I have to say about the card, and have to do with how highly I can see myself taking them. To help convey what each of these grades mean, I'm going to provide examples of cards from Amonkhet that I think deserve each of these letter grades. Let's start with A. Cards that are in A are bombs, an incredibly efficient removal, and are the kind of cards that you want to be first picking, or are so powerful that they pull you into their color. There are not a ton of A's in any format, and I'm pretty stingy with them. They are the best cards in the set, and the vast majority of them are mythic or rare, though occasionally uncommons make it into the A range. Some examples of A's from Amonkhet are cards like Angel of Sanctions and Glorybringer. These two cards are insane, and so powerful that they can win games on their own, both providing large flying bodies and the ability to remove other creatures, making them very powerful. Next, let's look at B's. These cards are obviously not quite as good as A's, but are still very good and are, in cases where there isn't a huge A-level bomb in the pack, still cards I'm happy to take with a first pick or an early pick. These are very good removal spells and very efficient creatures with powerful abilities. They aren't quite as game or draft warping as A's are, but seeing them past pick 4 or 5 is a pretty good signal that a color is open and for you to jump into it. Most B's are of uncommon rarity or higher, though occasionally commons can make it into the B range as well. Some examples of B's from Amonkhet are On-Crop Crasher and Angler Drake. These cards are very powerful and can help shift the game in your favor and are good at any stage of the game, but they aren't cards that completely warp a game when they are played, like, let's say, Angel of Sanctions or Glorybringer. Still, both of these cards are cards I'm happy to first pick and ecstatic to get any later than that. Next, we have C's. This is what the vast majority of cards in a set are, and they appear at every rarity with regularity. Solid and playable cards that you neither feel good or bad about having in your deck is sort of the definition of a C. These are decent creatures like 2-mana 2/2s with some small upside and solid removal. Some examples of C's from Amonkhet are cards like Colossopede, just a 5-mana 5/5, sure, it's fine, and Cursed Minotaur, a 3-mana 3/2 with Menace. These are both cards that you feel fine about having in your deck, but you don't exactly feel excited about. From there, we move to D's. These are cards that are playable, but just barely, and are cards that you generally aren't happy to have in your deck. They usually only end up there when something went wrong in your draft, like being unsure about what colors you should be in so you don't end up with enough playables, and thus you're forced into playing cards of this level. There were actually a lot of D's in Amonkhet because cycling made what would otherwise be F's into D's. Some examples of D's are Violent Impact and Watchers of the Dead. Neither of them really does enough to be card you're excited about having in your deck. Watchers of the Dead is a 2-mana 2/2 with no real upside, and Violent Impact is a bad artifact removal spell that happens to have cycling. You'll play them when you have to, but you don't really want to. Finally, we have F's. These are cards that I think you should never ever put into your deck and are terrible. Just like there aren't many A's in this set, there usually aren't many F's, but they are always around. Weirdly, there are actually a decent number of rares and mythics in this category, since they often like printing unique and strange effects on cards of that rarity. Some examples of S from Amonkhet are Glorious End, just is a terrible card. Any card that says you lose the game on it is probably not something you want to play. You had to end up in a very narrow situation for it to actually work. You had to cast it on your opponent's turn and be able to kill them on your next turn, otherwise you just lose. And Hazaret's Monument, just basically does nothing. You don't really want to be playing the card. It doesn't have a big enough impact on the game. It's not worth the card in general. In addition to these more clear-cut grades, there are also two categories of cards that I will present more than one grade for. The first of these are sideboard cards. These are cards that generally you don't want to have in your main board. They're either a D or an F if they're in your main board, but they are better in certain matchups out of your sideboard. An example of this from Amonkhet is Stinging Shot. It is a D in your main board, since it will frequently never have a target and just get cycled, but out of your sideboard, it gets all the way into the B range because it's incredibly efficient removal for dealing with flyers. The other cards I will present two grades for are build-around cards. These are cards that are generally a D or an F in your average limited deck, but if you manage to get enough synergies, they become much better. An example of this from Amonkhet would be Nest of Scarabs, an unplayable card in basically any limited deck, but if you end up with 10 or more ways to make -1/-1 counters, it moves all the way into the C+ and B- range. Alright, now let's jump into our first green card. Our first green card is Ambuscade, which for 2 generic and 1 green is an instant at common, and it says target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. When I first saw this card, I foolishly thought it was a fight effect, because otherwise it seemed too good. I'd also just gotten off of an international flight and was jet lagged. Those are the excuses I have for screwing up on my review of this card when I was talking about it on the Ether Hub, where I said it was only the second best green common, when in fact it's the best green common and a contender for best common in the entire set, because it's not a fight effect. It just does damage equal to the creature's power, comparable to cards like Tail Slash we've seen in the past that were quite good. Ambuscade is also an instant. Green almost never gets instant speed creature removal, and that makes it even better since you can cast it in response to combat tricks or auras and get 2-for-1s. It does come with the downside that all green removal spells come with. It opens you up to 2-for-1s if you play it when your opponent has cards in hand and open mana, so be careful. Also, you have to have a lot of creatures in your deck for this to be at its best, but your typical limited deck has like 15 anyway, and that should be plenty. This is premium removal and one of the best commons in the set. It gets a solid B from me. Be very happy to first pick it and play every copy that gets passed to you. Next we have Beneath the Sands, which for 2 generic mana and 1 green is a sorcery that says search your library for a basic land card. Put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. It also has cycling for 2 generic mana. This is a bad rampant growth with cycling, and that's not completely terrible. If you're desperate for fixing, it can do that for you. Though, as we will see, green has some better sources of fixing, as do lands. And if you don't need the fixing when you draw it, you can cycle it. One of the big downsides of a card like Rampant Growth and Limited is that you draw it when you have enough lands in play and already have all the colors you need, in which case it's pretty much a dead card. Adding cycling to an effect like this is nice because it means you can cycle it away when you already have what you need. Still, I don't think you'd play this card unless you didn't get any of the other better sources for fixing that can be found in this format, so I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Bitterbow Sharpshooters, which for 4 generic and 1 green is a 4/4 Jackal Archer at common with Vigilance and Reach. Vigilance and Reach are not the most exciting of keyword abilities individually, but the two of them together is nice as you can attack through your opponent's board of small flyers and then also block them. This does a pretty good job on the French vanilla test, as a 5-mana 4/4 with 2 keyword abilities is pretty reasonable. I think this card is about on par with Colossebead. It's a little smaller, but it comes with a lot more upside. This is a solid C. Decent filler for a green deck, and not a terrible thing to be ramping into on turn 3 or 4. Next we have Devotee of Strength, which for 2 generic and 1 green is a 3/2 Naga Wizard at uncommon, who for 4 generic and 1 green has an activated ability that says, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. A 3-mana 3/2 with some very real upside, Devotee of Strength is a good card. In the early game, it is just a reasonably costly creature who can get in for some damage or trade with a 3 toughness creature, and it has a nice mana sink ability that can make combat a nightmare for your opponent in the later part of the game, as a +2/+2 boost is pretty real. This is better than your average filler, getting close to the B level, but the activated ability is a little too high in cost for it to get there, so I'm going to leave it at C+. Next we have Dune Diviner, which for 2 generic and 1 green is a 2/3 Naga Cleric at uncommon that has an activated ability that says you can pay 1 generic mana, tap an untapped desert you control, you gain 1 life. I don't like this card at all. The 3-mana 2/3 needs to have a pretty impactful text box to get out of the D range, and this one doesn't. It can only occasionally gain you some life, but only if you have a desert in play, and only if you pay some mana for it, basically equivalent to 2 mana. This is below average filler, the exact kind of card you'll play when you find yourself short on playables or 3-drops, but won't see play the majority of the time you have it, so I'm giving it a D. Next we have Feral Prowler, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 1/3 cat at common, and it says when Feral Prowler dies, draw a card. A 2-mana 1/3 in green seems pretty weird to me. This would be worlds better if it were a 3/1 with the same ability, but probably should be an uncommon, I guess, if that's what it was. It's still an okay card, though. It can block creatures with 2 power for a while, and ideally trade with an X1, so you get a 2-for-1 out of the deal, but that's just not always going to happen. I like drawing cards, but I don't feel like this does a good enough job of making sure you get a 2-for-1 for it to make it out of the range of, sort of average filler. Most green decks would rather have a beefier 2-drop than this, too, so I'm giving this a C-. Next, we have Frilled Sandwallah, which for 1 generic is a 1/1 lizard at common, and it has the activated ability of paying 1 generic and 1 green, and Frilled Sandwallah gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Activate this ability only once each turn. This card is fun, as it is a clear callback to the Root Wallas of Magic's past, and it has some pretty sweet art. 1-mana 1/1s aren't very good if that's all they are, but this can pump itself up to 3/3 for a reasonable cost, and thus it can keep attacking much longer than your average 1-mana 1/1. Still, having to dump mana into it every turn just to make it a 3/3 has diminishing returns the longer the game goes on in most cases. This is fine filler. Aggressive green decks will feel fine about it, but it isn't something you should go after remotely early at all. I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Gift of Strength, which for 1 generic and 1 green is an instant that says target creature gets +3/+3 and gains reach until end of turn. It's also a common. This is a good combat trick. 2 mana for +3/+3 is usually worth putting in a creature-heavy deck, as that is basically always going to be enough to pump a creature big enough to take down a much larger blocker. This comes with the added flexibility of being good on defense sometimes, as it can allow you to take down an angel or dragon thanks to reach, but this is much better in a deck that is interested in turning creatures sideways than it is in a deck that wants to use this defensively. Tricks that give this big of a boost are hard to not trade up with, since you can make your 2/2 into a 5/5, and that's still going to take down a 4/4. Still, it is a trick, and only the best among them manage to make it out of the solid filler range, and this one doesn't quite do that for me, but I'm going to give it a C. You'll play a couple of them in most green decks if you're aggressive. Next, we have Harrier Naga, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 Naga warrior with a bunch of flavor text. Lately, other colors like red and white have been getting 2 mana 2/2s with no downside. That used to be something that only green got, but there's still one thing that other colors don't get, at least a common rarity, and that is 3 mana 3/3s with no downside. This card does get outclassed by creatures with Exert like Hooded Brawler, but there's going to be a lot fewer of those around in this format, and you could do a lot worse on a 3-drop. This is another C. Perfectly fine card you're never excited about or disappointed about, but it's a nice card to just play on turn 3 on curve. Next, we have Hope Tender, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 2/2 human druid at uncommon, and it has the activated ability of paying 1 mana, tapping it to untap a land, and it also has the activated ability of paying 1 mana and tapping it to untap 2 lands, and exerting it for that one. A 2 mana 2/2 with all kinds of text on it is usually a good thing, and that's what we have here. The Tender has the ability to exert itself and untap 2 lands, allowing you to ramp. It also helps you a little bit with fixing, sort of, since without exerting it, you can untap a single land, so if you need double of a certain color but don't have it, it can get you there. I think most of the time this is a 2 mana 2/2 mana dork, and that's something I want in all of my green decks, and is even worth taking relatively early. I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Hour of Promise, which for 4 generic and 1 green is a sorcery at rare that says, search your library for up to 2 land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Then, if you control 3 or more deserts, create 2 black zombie creature tokens. This card really wants you to play deserts. This thing lets you grab any 2 lands from your deck, including non-basic ones. This means it can help you fix, but also find you a utility land. Ideally, desert utility lands, because if you control 3 deserts after this, you get to make 2 2/2 zombies. If your deck doesn't have enough deserts in it, I don't think this card is really worth playing. It is too clunky to cast in a world where you don't also get the 2 2/2 zombies to develop your board while you're also ramping. It does provide fixing when you need it, and that makes it hard for me to give it an outright F, so I'll give it a D. In a deck that doesn't have enough deserts that's desperate for fixing, you could play this. I feel like you need in the neighborhood of 5 or more deserts to make this a good playable that you feel good about having it, or at least fine about having in your deck. And if you get there, it probably goes into the C or even, I think, C+ range, since getting 2 lands and 2/2 zombies for 5 mana is no joke. Next, we have Life Goes On, which for 1 green mana is an instant at common that says you gain 4 life. If a creature died this turn, you gain 8 life instead. Cards that do nothing but gain you life usually aren't worth it. You'd rather have a permanent or spell that actually impacts the board. Even though this can sometimes gain you 8 for 1 mana, I'm still not planning on ever mainboarding this card in this format, unless I get Crested Sunmare or something like that. It is, however, a good sideboard card against hyper-aggressive decks where it becomes worth the card. This is because aggro decks eventually run out of gas, and gaining 8 life is like negating at least one of their cards, so I give it a C out of the sideboard, but an F out of the main board. Next, we have Majestic Miry Ark, which for 4 generic and 1 green is a star chimera at Mythic, and it says Majestic Miry Ark's power and toughness are each equal to twice the number of creatures you control. It also says at the beginning of each combat, if you control a creature with flying, Majestic Miry Ark gains flying until end of turn. The same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance. This is an interesting card. Green regularly gets cards with the first effect on this card, that is power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control, in this case twice that. This card's second effect, though, borrowing keyword abilities from your other creatures is something we're more used to seeing in white. Either way, the Miry Ark is pretty nice. Even if you have only one other creature, it is a 5-mana 4/4 who will most likely only get bigger and find all kinds of upside once you start playing creatures with keyword abilities if you don't have them already. Worth noting that basically all of the human tokens in the format, the most common tokens around, have Vigilance. So in a deck making a lot of those, the Miry Ark will be huge and have Vigilance with no help from non-token creatures. I like the Miry Ark and would take it pretty high, first picking it in many situations, as it isn't too hard to make this creature get out of control. It isn't the best top deck in the world if you have an empty board, but in most other situations, even just 1 or 2 creatures in play, it will have an impact. And so for that reason, I'm willing to give this card a B+. It's one of the better cards in the entire set. I would first pick it basically anytime I see it. It's also easy to splash, by the way, if you end up in a deck that wants to splash. Our next card is Nissa's Defeat, which for 2 generic and 1 green is a sorcery that says destroy target forest, green enchantment, or green planeswalker. If that permanent was a Nissa planeswalker, draw a card. I don't know, Nissa, not only got defeated by Nicol Bolas, but she got the most terrible card in this cycle by a wide margin. The rest all cost less mana and do something far more impactful. I understand that green isn't supposed to interact with creatures very easily, but come on, this thing is terrible. All the others can interact with creatures in one way or another, but not this. It can blow up green enchantments and forests. How useful is that going to be in Limited? Not very. It is an unplayable mainboard card like all the cards in this cycle, but it's like a D out of your sideboard. I would only side it in if I saw, for example, a green planeswalker or a green enchantment or 2, and then maybe I'd think about siding it in, but neither of those is going to happen very often. Next, we have Oasis Ritualist, which for 3 generic and 1 green is a 2/4 Naga Druid at common, who has the activated abilities. First of all, one is tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So it just fixes for you and is a mana dork, but it can also exert itself and tap itself to add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. This is a good card. 4 mana for a 2/4 is only a little more than I want to pay for that stat line, and providing fixing and ramp are both things I like. Being able to splash a cast out or powerful gold card is the kind of thing the Ritualist enables, and it also enables you to play a 7-drop on turn 5, which is pretty awesome. There's some pretty beefy 7-drops that we're going to see on this list that it can help you get to, and that's just in green. I'm going to give this a C+. I would take it relatively early. It's certainly not first pickable unless your pack is incredibly weak, but I would take it pretty early. Next, we have Overcome, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a sorcery at uncommon that says creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. So this isn't quite Overrun. It gives a smaller stats boost, but it's also easier to cast, and it's still super strong and the kind of card that will end games. +2/+2 and trample to your whole team is no joke, especially when you're also exerting your creatures. This card is, of course, only going to be good in a 15+ creature deck, but most decks in this format will be there or higher. Just curving out and dropping this on turn 5 will end some games. And obviously it is even better if you're able to go super wide with a bunch of 1/1 tokens from Oketra's Monument or something. I think this card is worth first picking in weak packs because it has so much upside, but don't be upset about cutting it if you find yourself in a more controlling deck. I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Pride Sovereign, which for 2 generic and 1 green mana is a rare cat and a 2/2 that says Pride Sovereign gets +1/+1 for each other cat you control, and it also has 1 white mana, that's white mana on our green card, tap it and exert it, create 2 1/1 white cat creature tokens with lifelink. This is basically a gold card because if you can't use its activated ability, it really isn't very good, and because if you're only in green and you're not in white, you're probably not going to have enough cats to just play this. Like, you would probably need 6 or 7 or 8 cats to make this playable without its second ability. And you need white's help to get that many cats, because the cats are in green and white the most, as this card sort of indicates to you. So I think in a deck that has, let's say, a few cats in it and is green and isn't playing white, this is a D. So it's not going to be that good. You should probably cut it if you end up being mono green. However, if you can use its activated ability, it's a monster. You can make 2 cat tokens every other turn, and they have lifelink, which are amazing for chump blocking or helping you go wide enough against your opponent. On top of that, the Sovereign, obviously, makes itself larger every time it uses its activated ability. This card is interesting because I do think it is a little dangerous to first pick. Think about it as first picking a gold card, but I think that in packs lacking monocolored bombs or premium removal, it is probably worth taking the risk, as a really good gold card would be worth taking the risk on, and that's basically what he is. If you end up in the green-white color pair, he will be one of the best cards in your deck, and I'm going to give him a B+ in decks with both colors, and I would be perfectly happy, like I said, first picking it. even though it's a little bit risky because it just has such a high ceiling. Next, we have Quarry Beetle, which for 4 generic and 1 green is a 4/5 insect at uncommon, and it says, when Quarry Beetle enters the battlefield, you may return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield. 5 mana for a 4/5 is an okay rate, though nothing especially amazing. A vanilla 4/5 would probably be like a D+ or a C-. This has a little bit of added upside, as it can return lands from your graveyard directly to the battlefield. This means if you cycle the desert early, you can get it back into play late, or get your Evolving Wilds back to search for another land, or a utility land like the desert cycle that all sacrifice other deserts, you could get those back. This upside isn't significant enough to really make this card great or anything, though, and it's just average filler, and I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Rampaging Hippo, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a common hippo, as you might expect, in a 5/6 with trample and cycling for 2. Every color has one of these big overcosted creatures with cycling, both in Amonkhet and in this set, in Hour of Devastation, and I think they're all just average filler for basically the same reasons. You can cycle them in the early game. What usually makes high-costed creatures like this bad is that you can't do anything with them early, and sometimes you just die before you can cast them. Cycling helps you get around that. In the late game, you can play a large creature who can do some real work. A 5/6 with trample is big, and really, paying 6 mana for that isn't hugely overcosted. This is actually one of the more efficient cards in this cycle of cards, although I guess Greater Sandworm is probably the most efficient. This, as I said, is average filler thanks to the fact that it can do something at all stages of the game, whether it actually goes on the battlefield or gets cycled. So I'm going to give it a C. It's just average filler. You know, it's going to make the cut a lot of the time when you're playing green. Next, we have Ramona Excavator, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 Naga Cleric at rare, and it says you may play land cards from your graveyard. This is another 3 mana 2/3, and as I mentioned earlier, the text box really needs to do something significant to get a 3 mana 2/3 out of the D range. This has similar upside to the Quarry Beetle, except it's even more upside. It lets you do stuff with lands in your graveyard whenever you want to. In a format with cycling lands and lots of deserts that sacrifice themselves, this is definitely upside, but it isn't a ton. Even if your deck has 3 to 4 lands that end up in the graveyard on a regular basis, there will be games where this does nothing but be a 2/3, which again isn't the worst fail case, it's about a D, but this additional upside is enough to push Ramona Excavator up to a C- for me. Next we have Ramona Hydra, which for 3 generic and 1 green is a 3/3 Snake Hydra with Vigilance, Reach, and Trample, and it says Ramona Hydra gets +1/+1 as long as you control a desert, and Ramona Hydra gets +1/+1 as long as there are a desert card in your graveyard. This is another desert build-around. This one is playable, though not overly exciting in a deck with 0 deserts in it, since it is a 4 mana 3/3 loaded with 3 nice keywords. Once your deck gets a few deserts in it, this gets to be better, as it can be all the way up to a 5/5, though I think counting on it always being that is a bit dangerous. Getting it to 4/4 shouldn't be too hard if you have a few deserts, though. On the whole, this card is a solid playable in any green deck, and it gets a little better in a deck with a few deserts, but the question is whether or not you can really get away with playing enough deserts to consistently make this a 5/5, and I think the answer is that you won't normally be able to do it. This is just a straight up C, maybe a C+ in a deck with 0 deserts, but it jumps all the way up to a B if you have a few deserts. Next, we have Resilient Kenra, which is 1 generic and 1 green mana for a 2/2 Jackal Wizard at rare, and it says, when Resilient Kenra enters the battlefield, you may have target creature get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is Resilient Kenra's power. It also has Eternalize for 4 generic and 2 green, and Eternalize is the mechanic where you get to exile the card from your graveyard for a mana cost and create a copy of it on your battlefield, but the copy is a 4/4 zombie version of the card. So that means it gives +4/+4 when it comes into play after Eternalize instead of +2/+2. Like the red Kenra with Eternalize, Resilient Kenra is a 2 mana, 2-power creature with a ton of upside. 2 mana for a 2/2 who gives +2/+2 to one of your creatures would already be a good card. That's the kind of bonus one usually gets for Exert, so it is sort of like a better Exert for a turn, especially because you're also developing your board while making one of your other creatures very difficult to block profitably. Then it comes with the late game punch of Eternalize, which means it will come into play and give +4/+4 to something when it does, and be a reasonably sized 4/4 itself. Creatures who are great in the early game and in the late game are very good, and that's what Resilient Kenra is. I'm going to give it a B. It's a first pickable card. There aren't many cards you should take over in this format, though there are a few, as you can see from the cards that are ranked A- or higher, B+, I guess, or higher. Next, we have Ronins' Last Stand, which for 2 green mana is a sorcery, and it says create a 5/4 green snake creature token. Lands you control don't untap during your next untap step. As I've noted with the rest of these cards in this cycle, these are sort of difficult to evaluate. They are the exact kind of cards you have to play with to get a feel for, since they're so unlike anything we've ever seen before. However, I do think this is the one in the cycle that is best to cast in the early game, as thinking about playing a 2-mana at 5/4 and then having my 2 lands not untap on turn 3 is I'm willing to pay that. It's going to be hard for your opponent to deal with your 5/4 that early. You can play a 3rd land that's untapped on turn 3, maybe do something with that, and then on turn 4 you're back on track, and you still are probably going to have a 5/4 bashing into your opponent's face. In the late game, it's a little less powerful than some of the other of these cards in this cycle, especially like the blue one or the black one. But it still gives you a super efficient creature in the late game that can help stabilize your board or push your board over into being able to win the game. It is a pity the Snake token doesn't also get Trample or something, but I think this is still good enough to fall into the low B range. It's a first pickable card in a lot of packs, and I would feel fine about having it. Again, playing it on turn 2 is probably the ideal thing, which isn't the case with the rest of the cards in this cycle. You want to play them much later, and if you're playing it on turn 2, you're going to be in pretty great shape. Next, we have Ronins Stalwart, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 2/2 human warrior, and it says, you may exert Ronins Stalwart as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn and can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less this turn. This is a pretty high-quality common and a very aggressive 2-drop. The 2-mana 2/2 has some serious upside, as exerting it in the early game basically means it's unblockable, as many creatures won't be able to block it in the early stages since they will have 2 or less power. He isn't quite Gustwalker from Amonkhet, but the Stalwart seems like a common 2-drop that will go a long way towards developing Green's identity, and a card that helps Green decks win a lot of games. This was good enough for me to be a B- and is a 2-drop that I'm willing to think about first picking in a lot of packs. Next, we have Sidewinder Naga, who for 2 generic and 1 green is a 3/2 Naga warrior that says, as long as you control a desert, or there's a desert in your graveyard, Sidewinder Naga gets +1/+0 and has Trample. So it becomes a 4/2 with Trample when you have a desert somewhere. This card with Desert Synergy is less build-aroundy than some of them are. This is because it presents okay stats as a 3-mana 3/2, pushing it all the way into the D+ range just on its own. You'd play this occasionally if you really need a 3-drop, if you really need a creature in your deck, even if you have 0 deserts. However, once you have a few deserts, it becomes a 4/2 Trampler relatively often. But that's still not anything incredible. It's worth noting. I mean, a 4/2 Trampler will probably get in for some damage, but just get blocked by a 2/2 and die. So I give this a D+ in decks with 0 deserts, and it's just like average filler in a deck that has a few deserts. So I don't recommend taking it especially early, since even if you get the desert payoff, you're not exactly like wowing anybody. It's just a fine card. Next, we have Sifter Worm, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 7/7 Trampler, a worm, at uncommon. And it says, when Sifter Worm enters the battlefield, scry 3, then reveal the top card of your library. You gain life equal to that card's converted mana cost. This card plays super into the way I like to play limited Magic, so that's sort of something I'm telling you now. Maybe I'm overrating it a little bit. I love these sort of big, grindy, powerful creatures that make a huge difference on the game. And yes, this format might be a little too fast, but there's reasonable ramping at common and uncommon in this set, and Sifter Worm can come into play on turn 5 or turn 6 without too much effort. And this is a very strong curve topper. Not only do you get a great rate on a 7-mana 7/7 with Trample, which means blocking it is not going to be very much fun for your opponent, you also get to scry 3, which is no joke. By the time you're casting this guy, you're doing all you can to avoid drawing more lands, and he's going to help you do that. He can also gain you a bit of life, which doesn't hurt. Even just the scry 3, though, would be very good. If you're looking for a creature to ramp into, you could do a lot worse than this worm, and it seems like ramp is a little better in this format than in the last one, based on some of the cards we've seen in this review. Still, not every deck will want it, just those with green in them that can get to 7 mana quicker than usual, or make the game go long enough that this can just help them win the game between the large body, the life gain, and setting up your draws. Doesn't that sound awesome? So I'm going to give it a C+, just because it's not good in every deck, but there's definitely going to be decks where it's a B, decks that just need this as a win condition, and it'll do it for them. Next, we have Tenacious Hunter, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 Crocodile, and it says, as long as a creature has a -1/-1 counter on it, Tenacious Hunter has Vigilance and Death Touch, and that's at uncommon. This thing is a fail case of being a 4-mana 4/4. That's already good. A card that would easily get into the solid filler range as a C. We haven't really seen any other cards that are 4-mana 4/4s in this format at a rarity lower than rare. But the added bonus this has is enough to get it into the I'm excited to play this range. The -1/-1 counter can be anywhere on the battlefield, on your creatures or your opponents, and suddenly this becomes a creature with both Vigilance and Death Touch. Another nice combination since it means it can trade with anything on offense or defense. -1/-1 counters aren't that hard to come by in this format, especially in the black-green color pair, but other color pairs can make them too. This thing has a high floor as a 4-mana 4/4 and a good ceiling, so I'm willing to give it a B-, which means I think it's worth first picking in some packs. Our next card is Uncaged the Menagerie. This is a sorcery that costs X and 2 green at Mythic, and it says, search your library for up to X creature cards with different names that each have converted mana cost X, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. This mostly screams EDH to me. This card will frequently be too narrow in what it does to be good at limited. Note that you have to be looking for creatures with the exact cost of X and not X or less, so pumping a bunch of mana into this can be kind of pointless unless you're really trying to tutor up some creature in your deck that you really need to help you win the game. You have to have a lot of creatures somewhere on your curve for this to really be worthwhile, and I think paying 2 for X or 3 for X is going to be where this is at its best. Paying 4 and drawing 2 creatures or paying 5 and drawing 3 creatures both seems pretty good to me. But you have to have a few things going on. You have to have a lot of creatures at that spot in your curve, like 7, 8, maybe 10, especially at 2. And ideally they're going to have different names too, because if you have too many copies of, like, you have 4 or 5 of a certain 2 or 3 drop, Uncaged the Menagerie is going to get a lot worse because you can only search for creatures with different names. And all that said, like I said, paying 5 mana to draw 3 3-drops from your deck is something that sounds appealing to me. Just make sure you have a lot of either 2s or 3s when you play it. I'm going to give this card a D with the caveat that in some decks, it can probably make it into the C+ range, but this won't be very common. You aren't always going to end up with a deck with the right composition for this card to work. That's the last green card in Hour of Devastation. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. If you disagree with any of my grades, let me know in the comments. Discussing the cards in this set can't do anything but make us better at this new format. Also, if you want to make sure you catch future videos, including the last videos in this limited review and draft videos of Hour of Devastation in the near future, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, I'll be back with the final video reviewing all 199 cards in the set. The day after that, though, I'll be back with an archetype guide, which we'll look at a lot of these same cards, but talk specifically about what each color pair wants to be doing. Also, starting with Hour of Devastation, I have teamed up with 5colorcombo.com to improve drafting on their app. My card ratings are now used to help determine when the AI should select the cards, so the app has become much more realistic in terms of draft, so it's a great way to prepare for the format. Go check it out at 5colorcombo.com. You can find a link in the description below.